give up, don't give in. Don't you let the man win. Stand up, be proud. Say it with me, yeah. Say it loud. We will not be idle anymore. We will not be idle anymore.
Say hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. It is a pleasure to be broadcasting on WBAI in New York City. It has been great to find a home in a station in such a a major market like New York City, and I appreciate the space on their broadcast grid that WBI provides me. We also broadcast this show in Washington D.C. on WPFW, although I'll be doing a separate show for them tomorrow. We rebroadcast this show normally on Fridays in Washington too, so you can catch the show either place, but. And look, we always do a call out because we are asking for your financial contributions to these two stations. And WPFW is in fund drive mode, so I'll be doing some pitching for that station tomorrow. But for those who listen to this broadcast either on my podcast or on my videos that are placed on YouTube or on Facebook, know that I'm carried by both stations, and I appreciate any support that you can give to both stations because they are what enables this to be a radio show first and foremost, and podcasts and videos and everything else after that secondarily. So. Look, as many of you know, I was involved in producing a film, and that film we are in the process of taking it on the road. Our first screening of The Long Hope for this year is happening at the University at Buffalo on this Saturday at 11 p.m. Or I'm sorry, 11 a.m. We will be doing a screening, a bit of a lunch, and then we're going to do a panel discussion afterwards. So if you're in Western New York and you happen to be in that area, then by all means come join us. It is a free event. I will say we're also doing a screening at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center next month, and then the following month we are doing a screening at Mount Holyoke College, which is a kind of a it's in Massachusetts. It's one of the schools that's connected to basically Peter DeRico's a former established or former place of employment when he was teaching law at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They're connected somehow. So we look forward to those. But those are just a few events. I still put the call out to those who are listening to this broadcast. If you are interested in either collaborating or hosting in some manner a screening of this event, we are taking this on the road. We are willing to bring this film with us and do a screening and do a conversation. I think it's important that people understand the whole gist of this film is geared towards explaining that the legal doctrines that are tied directly to colonialism don't fit in any of your constitutional boxes that you think exist or that protect you. And because these legal doctrines, meaning the doctrine of Christian discovery, the trust doctrine, and the plenary powers doctrine, because these even exist, it shows that the United States is not a country that operates under the rule of law. It still, and very much so, operates under authoritarian rule. That's what the film teaches, and it's not opinion. It is matters of fact. We cite not only the cases, but but where this language comes from, and how it's been used not just 100 years ago, but today. And I think that's what is important. It's nice to think that the United States has had this period of rebirth and progress, and that they abolished slavery and they granted, or I should say, declared that the formerly enslaved were now U.S. citizens. They have done things with voting that never seems to be enough, but they seem to move in a direction. But now when it relates to Native people, the same slave era, pre-Civil War legal doctrines that existed in the early 1800s are still cited today in law, policy, and jurisprudence. And I think that's what we try to do with the film. So I think it's important that people realize what the film is for. It does have a purpose. It's not just entertainment. Um, but I think it's well worth the watch. It's well worth the listen, and you can go to my website, which is thelonghope.org. We've got some excerpts on there. You can see the calendar. You can offer comments and questions and that kind of thing. You can also reach out on that very website about the possibility of hosting an event or collaborating with an event. So I wanted to put that out there. Again, this Saturday is our first screening of this year, 2026, and we plan to do many more. And we are reaching out across the continent. So whether you're in the Northwest or whether you're in the Plains area, the Southwest, the Southeast, we want to come to your territory. And look, we want to reach out to Native people. But we also want the Native people. We need allies. We're not going to affect the changes that we need to affect without support. So that's why we have both targeted Native territories, Native communities, and non-Native communities. I think doing these screenings in places like New York and in Washington, D.C. are important. But beyond where we are listened to on the radio, we would like to reach other areas that have, especially areas that have a Native population that are still impacted by this stuff, or this very stuff today. So I want to put that out there. So here's what I want to talk about today. I mentioned a few things over the past couple of weeks, some of the concerns I had about certain Seneca Nation policies, and something interesting has transpired over the last month. What I saw with the Seneca people, and I had no role in this, so to the extent that I try to promote change and advocate for people to get involved, I got to give full credit to the Seneca people. They organized. They organized because what their legal, or what their leadership, for lack of a better word, their president in particular, and the executive branch of the Seneca Nation did, was they entered into a policing agreement. They negotiated with a Republican-elected county sheriff to do a policing agreement on Seneca territory. Now, and I can get into some reasons why they did such a thing, and there are some reasons they did it, although I don't think they necessarily hold up. But here's the thing. A year ago, the Seneca Nation did a referendum asking the Seneca people just that, if they wanted to enter into a policing agreement, whether they wanted to pursue possibly forming a police force, which meant they would be enforcing state law. And almost by a 2-to-1 margin, the Seneca people rejected that. But in spite of that, because of a series of events, and I'll get into what some of those events were, the current leadership, primarily the president of the Seneca Nation, decided that he was going to be aggressive in trying to deal with certain activities that were happening on Seneca territory. And like many communities, our communities here have been ravaged by drugs and substance abuse and some of the other violence that not only comes with it but can be associated with it. And I think in an attempt to address something that the nation itself either believes that they're ill prepared to deal with, they decided they were going to partner, and it gets political because the sheriff of Cattaraugus County is an elected official, and he ran as a Republican, so he's pro-Trump. They have negotiated with Republicans in the state legislature and Republicans in Congress, and I kind of understand their logic. They haven't done well with their dealings with Kathy Hochul, the Democrat governor of the state of New York. But you got to be careful what you wish for, and that's just it. And I'll get into some other things. But so they entered into this agreement, and they were going to pay the Cattaraugus County sheriffs somewhere in excess of $1 million a year to police their territory. Now, and there's two communities. There's the Seneca Nation Allegheny territory, which includes the city of Salamanca, that already has a police force, a municipal police force that's non-native, and of course that's in Cattaraugus County. And then there's the territory that I live on, which is the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation, and it straddles 3 counties: Cattaraugus County, Chautauqua County, and Erie County. And so they enter into this agreement to provide policing, and part of it was supposed to be addressing some of the degradation that's taking place in the Allegheny territory. But where most of the policing was taking place was up here on in the community that I live in, and so the people were really angry. They were angry that they went and did this agreement after they held a referendum that rejected the idea. And so the people themselves, they organized. There was no Seneca Nation meetings. They were Seneca People's meetings, and they held them in a variety of places. Some that were at personal businesses, business locations, then into some of the community spaces. And they organized enough to go to council last week on Saturday, and they pressured and forced the sitting councilors. I think there were 14 of them present, and I could get some of these numbers wrong. I don't go to these meetings. I'm not Seneca. I'm Mohawk. I live here, but and I think they got the councilors who were present to vote unanimously to rescind the policing agreement. So couple of things. Yes, they did go to council and they pressured. They submitted a draft resolution to rescind it that was somewhat modified so the council could pass it. So they did follow a process. But I guess to my point that I think people need to understand is they didn't wait for that process. They went on their own. They held meetings. Now, I won't say they did it longhouse style with the three sides that I talk about sometimes, but they did it in a manner that invited the public to participate, and that's what's key. So they had a pretty open invitation to people, Senecas in particular. I didn't go because I didn't want to be a distraction for one thing, but it was open to the community, primarily Senecas, and they addressed this issue and several others that still are hanging out there, and I'll talk about some of those later on. But part of the issue was the way the Seneca Nation president had cast this out was that somehow the Seneca Nation territories were becoming a hotbed of illegal activity, and he went so far as to suggest that cartels were utilizing the sovereignty of the Seneca Nation to operate with impunity, and that between their cartel drug dealing and human trafficking, that these native territories, Seneca territory, was being utilized in a way. And there's no evidence that any of that stuff exists. Now, I'm not suggesting. We live in an area between Jamestown, New York, which is a real hotbed of a lot of drug dealing and drug activity, and Buffalo, New York, which has its own issues. So we live between those two places. So yes, there is a certain level of that that bleeds onto the territory. And I will suggest that in spite of the fact that Congress passed a law in the 40s, I think, called U.S. 232 and 233, which essentially granted, this was Congress asserting its plenary powers again, and granted New York State criminal and civil jurisdiction on activities on territory. Now, the people here rejected that. And because of that rejection, it's kind of existed, yes, on the books, that New York State can claim to have criminal and civil jurisdiction on native territories, especially in New York, but here in Seneca territory. But they're wary about it. And so there's always been pushback to police presence here. There's always been pushback to state law being enforced on our territories and everything to do with our commerce, but just generally. I mean, even to the extent that people challenge a speeding ticket issued to them on native territories by a non-native police force. That gets challenged, and many times those cases are thrown out if they are properly addressed by the defendant in those cases. So there does exist a bit of a question mark about state jurisdiction on our territory. Not according to their law, but according to what we're willing to accept. Now, having said that, is there a certain level of impunity that perhaps somebody feels they can enjoy by coming here? Yes, there probably is. But from a state standpoint, the New York State always has the power to stop illegal activity from entering our territories and when it leaves our territories. And most of these, primarily these drug dealers, are people who are active in both Jamestown and Buffalo. So it's not like the state police and the county police don't know who they are. And we don't manufacture any of that stuff here. It's coming to our territories from the outside. And so, I mean, they always had the power to do something. And they certainly didn't need to be paid to do it. But that's what's happened. But over the course of the last year, we did have a couple of deaths here. on Seneca territory. In fact, there was one not far, just one street over from my house, and it was a shooting and then a suicide that followed. But it wasn't tied to drug dealing, and I'm not suggesting that the young people involved weren't struggling with perhaps some substance abuse and certainly with with access to guns and that kind of stuff. That certainly was the case, but it wasn't a crime associated with drug dealing or human trafficking or anything else. It was a tragedy. Two young Native people lost their lives in that incident, and to suggest that somehow increasing drug enforcement on the territory would have prevented that is quite a stretch. Now, on the other territory in Allegheny, or in the city within the city of Salamanca, there were also two deaths that happened recently. One of them was a guy who was an absolute innocent victim of violence. He was basically beaten up. He was mugged and died as a result of the beating that And he was an elderly gentleman, a very popular person within the Seneca territory, and he was beaten essentially to death by somebody who was trying to rob him, apparently for money for drugs. But that's the story. Now, again, it wasn't a drug deal gone bad. It wasn't a drug dealer violence issue. It was a guy with a serious substance abuse problem who had stooped to a violent level to address his addiction, the way I understand it. So that was one. The other one was a woman who is essentially from this territory originally, but she was living in Salamanca, and she was the victim of some violence. Again, it wasn't violence associated with a drug deal gone bad. It was again violence against a woman by some men. The woman was Seneca, and the men were I think were Native as well. And I'm not saying that substance abuse wasn't involved, but it wasn't a drug deal. It wasn't a drug dealer violence issue. The issue with this one was the woman was also related to both the president and one of the sitting councilors, and possibly more than one sitting councilor. And so there was grief, and there was pain and suffering felt at both by the community and by people who had political power to act. And I think some of their grief and their desire to respond to violence forced them to embellish the drug dealing issue, the human trafficking issue, and then make a deal that the people had rejected. So that's kind of what took place. So on one hand, I'm sympathetic to those who lost loved ones, and again, some of that violence that took place was literally, I'm going to tell you, I heard the gunshots for what took place, in the neighborhood that I live in, and we were all deeply disturbed. And some of these kids were friends of my grandson. I mean, so it's painful. And you don't know what the right response is. But you can't have just a knee jerk reaction. And I think that's part of what happened. And I think you end up having a situation where people who are elected throw their hands up and they seek the most aggressive response to some sort of breakdown in our communities. And that's what happened there. And, and our people, the people in this community, they said, look, we get that. We get that we have a substance abuse problem. We have some drug dealers, but you know what? They've been running these drug dealers off the territory as it is. They've been banishing some or excluding them, as they call. There was even a house where that the community rose up and burned the whole residence because of the drug activity. So the people have stepped up before, and in many ways, the Seneca Nation has allowed organizations. There's an organization of women that mothers that are involved in pushing back on this, and of course, what we still have yet to really establish is what is the role of men in that are not nation officials. What's our role? And I think we've seen some of that show up. I mean, we've seen the men respond to some of this stuff, and this is a challenge. But what we saw in this pushback to what the leadership was attempting was, to me, encouraging, because to see that level of participation by people across all segments of the community. I was pleased to see it. I was proud of them for doing it, and part of the reason I'm talking about this on my New York City radio show is because it really comes down to something that I try to talk about often, and that's the power that we have as people. So whether we're talking about ICE or whether we're talking about policies that are politically motivated or get caught up in the culture wars or whatever else, or what, I think our ability to provide pushback and actually change some of those policies is a real thing. And I think we have to do as much as we can to make that a reality. And here yes, I get it. Seneca Nation, small community, small politics by most standards. I mean, the governing system is small and that kind of stuff. But watching the people step up was impressive. But I also, and this is why I mentioned some of the things that I personally have been involved in, like the ban of native mascots in high schools in New York State. I mean, that wasn't a big campaign. That was just doing enough research to have the information, taking it to the right people that are not my people. We took this to the New York State Department of Education, and because the arguments are so solid for why this thing should not exist, it wasn't a heavy lift. And because I took it to a fairly apolitical organization or agency like the Department of Education, I didn't get mired in the culture wars and how much the Democrats or the Republicans are worried about how much base they're going to lose if they take a position on something. So, I guess the reason I even bring that up, these are two examples of people doing something. And so no matter where you live, and no matter what somebody tells you is the process, I'm always of the mind, look, if you feel like the process is being afforded to you is ineffectual, then don't use it. Come up with another process. We need to be more active. I've been saying this even in light of what's happened in Minnesota and Minneapolis. The people still overwhelmingly outnumbered those ICE agents that were on the ground. And oftentimes what I've seen in so many incidents, whether it was in New York City when it was Eric Gardner or whether it's George Floyd, you see examples of people shooting video. And I'm not saying that's not important, that we capture that stuff. But you know what? If you're there, I get it. Trying to stop a police officer from doing what he is now committed to doing is dangerous business. It's dangerous business. But at some point, the people need to step up. And so whether it's resisting, violence on, police abuse of violence, or whether it's these ICE agents, I think we all have to do more. I mean, look, 10,000 people, made it their way to Standing Rock, and the pipeline still got built. So just getting together and just showing up at a protest or a rally isn't enough. So I guess, what I was encouraged by with the Seneca people was them developing a process and then ultimately using what is existing in terms of going into the Seneca Nation Council to affect real change. Now, the Seneca Nation still got some issues. They've got some major issues. As many of you know, because I've talked about the gaming compact that is required by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, another imposition by the plenary powers doctrine of Congress, which basically forced Native people to enter into gaming contracts, regulatory systems contracts with the states that surround them in order to do quote unquote legal gaming. And that's crap. That's like telling you, no, we think you're incompetent. We don't believe that you're trustworthy enough, so we're going to make you slip into bed, get under the sheets with the state, regardless of the state and how corrupt they are. And New York State has demonstrated just how corrupt they really are. And the worst that we've dealt with have been the Democrats. So for all those who think that, Republicans have a monopoly on racism, well, that's not really the case. And we see it over and over again. We see Letitia James going after the Shinnecock over them putting a sign up on their territory. We've seen Kathy Hochul veto bill after bill after bill that protected everything from burial sites to environmental issues, and of course, some of what she's pulled against the Seneca people. So we know that Democrats can be every bit as racist. And again, I don't need to remind people, Letitia James is a black woman, so it's not even race related. Yes, a black person can still promote white supremacy if that's the system that they're operating in. And that's what we've seen with Letitia James. She also cut a deal with Connecticut School District to allow them to keep the name T-Birds in replace of Thunderbirds. Like that was some change. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But so I think we have to realize, excuse me, I think we have to realize that we have work to do. And you're not going to just vote your way out of this because the choices that you're given to vote for are oftentimes two sides of the same two sides of the same coin, that is. I'm sorry. The native thing, that was a Freudian slip from a native person standpoint. So, no, I think it's really important that we really step up. And I know it's tough. I mean, we look, we're all struggling. We're all trying to live hand to mouth. And while we see the injustices, we don't oftentimes see a pathway for us to address that. And the reason you don't is because they're not going to give you one. You gotta create one. And look, when you're trying to create a response to some injustice, you realize that you're already dealing with injustice. So yes, it's entirely possible you're going to face some injustice as you're opposing it. But I got to remind people, this is the world that we live in. If you want change, you've got to push for change. And you need to collaborate with people, and not necessarily the people that you see eye to eye with 100%, but certainly on issues. Certainly on issues. I mean, look, there should be no question about our need to protect children and to prosecute pedophiles like those in the Epstein files and those that are all over both parties, all over industry, all over the billionaire class. Yes, look, if they can arrest Prince Andrew, then why not arrest Donald Trump? So, I mean, these are issues. And I realize that there are loyalists right now that exist in U.S. politics, that there is almost nothing that a Donald Trump and some of those people on the right could do that would turn you. And I realize that. But I'm not even talking to you. I'm talking to the people who are still on the fringe, those people who are still indifferent about the role they can play. I mean, Donald Trump once bragged that he could go down to Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody in the street and it wouldn't hurt his voting. He wouldn't lose votes over it. And he's right. He obviously can be involved with molesting little girls, and nobody seems to be concerned about it. So, look, we all need to do more. We need to speak out. We need to educate. We need to educate ourselves first. Part of the reason that we did the Long Hope film was because we realized that much of the information that we think we need to get out there is available, but if you don't know to look for it, you won't ever find it. You don't know the question to ask. So when we take this film on the road and we present some of this information, we do it with the explicit purpose of not only giving you information to questions you never asked, but perhaps give you enough information so you'll ask more questions. One of the things that we talked about in the film was the fact that the revenue sharing that exists for the Seneca Nation with the state of New York, it sounds different than it is in reality. And what the revenue sharing amounted to was that the state was going to provide some level of exclusivity for Seneca Gaming. They really didn't, but that's what the pledge was. That was the commitment. They would offer exclusivity, and in exchange for that, the Seneca Nation would pay the state 25% of what was called the net slot drop. That's 25% of the revenue generated by the slot machines after payout. That's 25% off the top. So that sounds like, oh yeah, they give 25% and they get to keep 75%. No, they don't. They don't get to keep 75%. They have to operate the entire facility off of that 75%. So what ended up, when all the dollars are counted, in 21 years of operation, the state of New York actually claimed to be entitled to more revenue based on that 25% than the Senecas did. Now, in reality, the Senecas took in $2.4 billion and the state took in $2.2. But the only reason the Senecas took in a little bit more than the state was because they withheld $200 million in what was a breach of the compact. Had they not done that, the state literally would have made more money off of their 25% share than the Senecas do off of their 75% share. Because when you cover the cost of all the employees, all the vendors, all the products, all the services, all of the insurances, all of the contracts and the licensing, the utilities, the upkeep, the maintenance, the replacing of carpets on a regular basis, all that stuff, the cost of the things that you give away, all of the amenities. Yeah, the Senecas took a beating. And the state got money for nothing. One of the things that was revealed in the last couple of weeks was that the casino that operates on the Allegheny territory in the city of Salamanca is actually losing money. Now, you're probably saying, see, Donald Trump wasn't the only one who couldn't make money with a casino. Well, let me explain why they're losing money. The gaming compact that the Senecas have with New York State is supposed to have been renegotiated. And the push that came from the people all along was no more revenue sharing, no more revenue sharing. The guy who ran for the Seneca president, who's sitting as the Seneca president, he ran on a platform of no more revenue sharing. But once he got in there, started talking about, well, we could pay them for something. And in the meantime, in the absence of having an agreed upon and negotiated and signed gaming compact, they've been operating off the old one. So that 25% of the net slot drop that existed for 21 years has continued. Now, they haven't turned that money over, but they're setting that money aside in an escrow account that the state of New York thinks that they're going to get. Ultimately, they believe they're going to get that. So when you took 25% off the top of the revenue that was coming in at the Seneca Allegheny Casino, what was left wasn't enough to cover the expenses. Why is that? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because 25% is 25%. That doesn't change. Now, 25% of what might change, and the reality is gaming revenue has diminished. In general, the flow of money into Seneca gaming, and in fact, most gaming has diminished. Why? Well, for one thing, the market's been saturated. It's been tapped into by sports betting. Now you even got these predictive betting sites out there where you can just bet on anything. You can bet on how many times I say bet. I mean, there are all kinds of models for these predictive sites where you can bet on. There's the lotteries have expanded. More gaming sites have expanded. New York State is going to build more casinos. So the market has become increasingly saturated, including the market that the Seneca Nation is losing. Now, one of the things that the Seneca Nation president was hoping was they could expand into mobile betting, like gaming on your phone and that kind of stuff. And that's what he considered paying the state for, even though the state has no ability to give him that right to do it. But as it exists right now, between the market diminishing but the costs increasing, you've got to pay people a little bit more. Labor hasn't gone down in price. The cost of all the services and all of the expenses associated with gaming and maintaining these things, all those costs went up. So every time something went up a little bit more, it took from that 75%. So what exists right now is the Seneca Allegheny Casino is no longer profitable as long as they're taking that 25% off the top, which is all the more reason to stop doing it. But see, this is, again, there's nothing in the law that says the Senecas must share the revenue. There's nothing in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act that says that. But what is in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is the requirement, the absolute requirement that the gaming operator, the native gaming operator, negotiate a gaming compact with the state. The problem is that the state can say, look, we're not interested. So you end up in a situation where you have to buy the political will from the state to even negotiate a compact. So even though it wasn't required by law, it becomes required by law because the compact itself is required. Now, I don't know. I hope all that makes some sense to you. But at the end of the day, the main point here is that the states it's not a level playing field with the states. Because if you're going to suggest that the federal law that dictates what is legal and unlawful gaming requires the Seneca Nation to partner in some way, some capacity with the state, and the state gets to say, I'm not really that interested, then you're actually forcing native gaming operators to buy that political will. That's revenue sharing. In a nutshell, that's what revenue sharing is. And you know what? The Interior Department, whose job it is to to regulate this, they know it. The former Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, the native lady, she claimed she was going to do a rule change to level that playing field. Never happened. She was appealed to repeatedly by the Seneca Nation for what the New York State was doing, including when New York State extorted $500 million out of them, so Kathy Hochul could turn around and give it to her billionaire buddy for a new Bills stadium in Buffalo. I mean, the Seneca Nation tried over and over again to get the Interior Department to say, look, if you're going to force us to pay, if the gaming compact is going to force us to pay the state, then it's no longer an agreed upon payment. Now it is like a tax, and it's up to you to enforce this. Deb Haaland refused. She did nothing. She posed for more pictures, left office. Now she's running for the governor of New Mexico. Well, good luck, and she'll probably win because Democrats do well in New Mexico, I guess. And first and foremost, she's a Democrat. That's why she didn't take a position against the Democrat governor from New York. That was one of her fellow party members. One of her, one of the women of the Democratic Party. She was going to challenge that, and she didn't. So I say all this stuff so people understand that we are still facing oppression. Even as we're struggling. Look, the Seneca Nation, I know people have said, well, the Seneca still took in $2.4 billion. Let me put that in perspective. $2.4 billion over 2 decades is not a lot of money. It's less than some of the school districts in Western New York, their annual budgets. So before you get all Google-eyed over the word billions showing up behind dollar signs, understand that that's the entire amount of money that the Seneca Nation had to operate its nation expenses, including its employees, many of which are non-native, including all the services they provide to the Seneca people, many of which is still money leaving the Seneca Nation going into the regional economy, because we don't have those services necessarily here. We have to buy them. We have to buy the professional services. We have to buy everything. Even as even as we're giving money for education and that kind of stuff, even as we're giving out some of the revenue from gaming, that money gets spent right into the regional economy. So anybody who thinks that, the Senecas, they're all living large. No, they're not. 30% of the Seneca population still lives at or below the poverty line in spite of this. Why? Because half the revenue is being taken by New York State. I mean, there's no way to get around this thing. And it's not even half the revenue. Now it's even more than half. It's so much so in the least lucrative of the 3 gaming facilities that the Seneca Nation has, which is in a fairly rural, mountainous region in the Allegheny Mountains. Beautiful site, beautiful place, beautiful facility, but essentially overbuilt for the market. And so they're losing money. They're losing money because 25% off the top is being set aside. That is not going into the Seneca coffers. That is not going into benefiting Seneca people. It's going into a pot with the governor of the state of New York drooling over that pot, waiting for her to get her hands on it. And let me remind you how she got her hands on the last bunch of money. She froze all of the operating accounts of the Seneca Nation, every one of them, including accounts that were writing checks to non-native employees and vendors and suppliers. So this is the tactic that she has used to extort over $500 million, most of which she turned around and gave to Terry Pagula, the owner of the Buffalo Bills, because he was trying to extort money out of the state under the threat of removing the Bills to another city, Toronto, maybe even leaving the country with it, because billionaires can play that game. The rest of us don't. The rest of us are victims of this stuff. So I think it's important that people realize that this is the situation, right? This is what we're up against. Look, I talked about the fact that, those who suggest that the U.S. Constitution was based on our culture and that kind of stuff, and I refuted that in the last program or two. There's no question that the political system that exists in the United States is geared towards protecting and elevating the wealthy class. That's what it is. I mean, if you're a billionaire, you can buy votes for your favorite candidate. You can buy laws. You can buy influence in any number of ways, and that's what's being done. You can also quash investigations like the Epstein file investigation. Look at all the billionaires that are loaded into those files, and that's why you've got a Justice Department that has done nothing, and then you've got some of the media that supports the current regime suggesting, well, that that it's already played out. There's nothing there. There's nothing. I mean, I've listened to right-wing pundits over and over again suggest that Trump's not mentioned in the files, and of course that is not true. That's not true. But see, this is what being rich will afford you. You've got Bill Gates. You've got Elon Musk. You've got the wealthiest people on the planet who are in these files. And yet, nobody's going to be prosecuted. And let me remind people what these files are about. These are about girls, not women, not young women, girls being exploited, sexually trafficked for the billionaire class. So, when I hear anybody suggest that because of their religious upbringing, the family values are what drives them and motivates them, no, it's not. It's not. And in fact, we all know what the clergy sex abuse scandals have led to. $1 million payouts to former altar boys and other children who were molested by priests. And I'm going to tell you right now, and I've said it on Facebook. Every federally funded and state funded Indian boarding school that existed for 150 years, every one of them were Epstein Islands. Every one of them. Every one of them had children being sexually and physically abused, exploited for labor, tortured, forced assimilation and indoctrination. And all of this was about ethnic cleansing. It was genocide. By definition, it was genocide. And we still exist today in a world where none of that's been addressed. We don't address, 100 years of slavery. We don't address 150 years of residential schools. We don't address any of it. Instead, we look at white people who have made their billions and millions and say, oh, look, they lifted themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, I got to tell you, we didn't have bootstraps. So this is the world that we live in. And that's why, as a Native person, I'm trying to say, if you don't understand what was done to us, then you're not really understanding what was done and what is being done to you. Yeah, it was big news because 2 white folks got murdered by ICE agents in Minneapolis. Well, I got to tell you, we've had our people murdered for centuries. Oh, everybody's real concerned about Savannah Guthrie's mom being missing. There are 4,000, 5,000 Native women missing every year that never get investigated. Remember Gabby Petito, the pretty little blonde girl who was doing video posts or blog posts on or podcasts on travel? When she was missing, just like with this Guthrie case, it was 24/7. Every day it was in the news. There were at least a half a dozen Native women who were rendered missing from the same area that Gabby Petito was taken from when she was murdered. But you never saw any of that because nobody cared. But take a wealthy white woman, regardless of age, elderly in this case of Savannah Guthrie's mom, and I do feel bad for her. I felt bad for Gabby Petito. But what makes it tough is that when you realize what's happening to people of color, not just Native people, There are black girls that are turned up missing every single day that nobody ever hears about, nobody ever reads about. There are Native people. Native people are disproportionately victims of sexual abuse, sex trafficking, and murder. That's just a matter of fact. Those are the numbers speak for themselves. And you're not going to get the news cycle covering any Native person missing like you're seeing with this Guthrie case or the Patino case. So my message to people is that we have to do more. Justice isn't about whether they catch Savannah Guthrie's mom's kidnapper or not. That's not justice. Because if you catch that kidnapper, and if she is lucky enough to survive this ordeal, that's not justice. Because at the same time, in this same period of 2 weeks that have transpired, dozens of Native women have been rendered missing that nobody cares about. So this is why I do what I do. I try to put some perspective here. Now, I mean, the fact that I can name Gabby Patino still to this day shows you how much that name was drilled into my head during the period of time that she was missing and then discovered murdered. That's how much it was driven into my head. The fact that Guthrie's name can just roll off my lips is because that's how much it's being driven in my head. But honestly, as I sit here, even as a Native person, I could have looked it up, and I probably should have, out of respect. But I can't name the half dozen or dozen or several dozen Native women who turned up missing during that same period of time, or who've turned up missing in the last couple of weeks. That's sad. I mean, and I feel bad for that. And perhaps on a later show, I'll create a list, because those names need to be known. Just like everybody knows about Preddy and can't even think of her name right now. The woman who was killed and the man who was killed in Minneapolis. I mean, Good. I'm sorry. Yeah, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Everybody knows their names, but do you know the other names? The people who had darker skin than them? Because if you don't know, I've heard report after report after report, and I even got on WBAI for it and WPFW, because they said, well, 2 Americans were killed. Well, there were more than 2 Americans killed since ICE started their activities. The point was that 2 white ones did, and that becomes the default for what is an American. Out of the 4,000 or 5,000 people that have been taken into custody, my question is, how many really warranted deportation? And I don't know, as I sit here today, that they've located some of the Native people that they swept up in their raids. Homeless Native people. I know the last I looked, they still weren't being fully accounted for. And that's just one area. So as this current regime continues its aggressive tactics in and again singling out people of color and singling out those people who are protesting it, because let's be honest, nobody was going after Renee Good and Alex Preddy. They just stepped up. And I know it's what I spoke of earlier. If you're going to fight back, push back against injustice, there's a risk to it. And I can't tell people how far to push that risk. But I know we have to do more than what we're doing. And you know what? Alex Preddy and Renee Good should not have been singled out. You know how you prevent them from singling out? Have hundreds or thousands of people there. Don't let it be just one guy helping a woman being beaten up by ICE agents. There should have been a flood of people there, not just Alex Preddy. So that's my recommendation, is that we all need to do more. And yes, I realize that these are individual choices that we need to make, but we have to do them together. That's why the Seneca people were able to do what they did with the Seneca Nation last weekend. Because they stepped up as a group. They organized. Like I said, you're not going to vote your way out of this problem. Because on either side of the political spectrum, our problems. A Democrat isn't going to fix. I guarantee, regardless of what happens in the midterm elections, the stock market's going to continue to rise. The rich are still going to get richer. The environment is still going to suffer. And it doesn't matter how many Democrats you elect. Why? Because they have some of the same motivations. You have to do more. I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying that. I'm not going to vote in your elections, but I'm not telling you not to. I'm saying you need to do more than that. You can't just check a box. You can't just check a box and say, there, I've done my civic responsibility. We're living in a time where civility is under assault. However you want to define that. And the only way is to push back. And you push back by organizing, by educating yourselves and others around you. And come up with a game plan. I hate to see anybody place themselves in harm's way. But unfortunately, we're living in trying times that's going to force many of us out of what has been our comfort zone. And when I say force us out of the comfort zone, I don't mean hang around the conflicts so you can take selfies of yourself or capture video that you can post up on your TikTok page. No, we need to do more than that. We need to do more than that. So that's what I'm saying. And I'm proud of the Seneca people doing what they did. They got work to do. They still have more work to do. And it's going to be interesting to see how things play out for the Senecas. I know one of the issues that's still plaguing the Seneca people is a commitment by the current administration to spend $1 million plus on the non-native elections, which is a complete violation of what we call the Tua Wampa, the Deohade, which says, no, we stay on our path, you stay in your path. Why the Seneca Nation would want to spend $1 million on the midterm elections? Who are they going to advocate for? Which party? And which party do you think you're going to get a commitment of? Because we haven't gotten a commitment out of any of them. Yeah, we get a bunch of them that want to blow smoke up our butts. Why? Because they want to unseat a governor or they want to unseat a congressional spot. That's all they're interested in. They're all just about self-preservation and self-promotion. They'll tell us what we want to hear, but they're not going to do what they need to do. They're not going to do the right thing. And they've proven it. Both parties have proven it over and over and over again. We've got to stop the corruption. And that corruption, is local, it's regional, it's, at the state level, and it's at the federal level. So we need to do more. We need to apprise ourselves of the situations. We need to educate, and we need to broadcast what we learn so others know as well. That's what needs to happen. Now, that's not detailed. I realize that's not detailed. But that's what I'm saying we need to do. We need more of. I'm proud of what the Seneca people did. And I'm hoping that we can start seeing this. And I'm proud when I see a big turnout when there's a pushback on some of this corruption. But it can't just be for photo ops, folks. At some point, there has to be a certain level, and I'm going to say it, of physical resistance. I'm all for nonviolent direct action. But nonviolent direct action is still action. It's not just taking pictures of yourself with a big crowd. So that's my message to you. That's what I wanted to tell you about how proud I was of what the Seneca people had accomplished last week. Because I want them to serve as an example to what can happen in every municipality, every county, every district in your state, and every state in your country. There are examples of what you can do. And the Senecas, put their best foot forward, and I'm proud of what they did. But they need to do more too, because there's still a lot of unsettled issues that need to be dealt with here for Native people. And our biggest problem is not internal, because even when we have problems internally, that's driven by the outside. That's just a matter of fact. So we need to do more. Again, I want to encourage people to seek out, learn more about our film, The Long Hope. Come out and join us when and where you can. And by all means, reach out to me and let's set up some screenings in your area so more people can realize what our long hope is and what we're working against to see that hope become a reality. That's what I'm talking about. I want to thank you for listening. I am John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. Thank you, WBAI, for providing me this space, and we'll see you next week. I'm John Kane. Yahweh.